Hi, welcome back. This is the second video in our series this month on common skill deficits. And so today we're talking about commonly missed skill deficits. In my job, one of the things that I often do is I diagnose disabilities in children. So when a child is referred to me for an assessment, I'm looking to see, does this child have autism? Do they have depression? Do they have a learning disability? Do they have ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder? What is the disability that this child has? Now, when you're looking at disabilities, a lot of times we think about disabilities as far as somebody being physically disabled. But when we're looking at disabilities with mental health, they can't always be seen. And so a lot of times they're a disability in the brain as far as some aspect of brain development did not occur normal or typical. And so these children have an actual disability, but it's not a visible disability. So when we're looking at ADHD, a lot of times that's a deficit in impulse control. It's usually a deficit in that frontal lobe of the brain. That's the part of your brain that controls impulse control. And if you were to look at things using MRIs or functional scanning, EEGs, you might see that there are visible deficits in the brain functioning. But when we just look at a child, we can't necessarily see where those deficits are. But they do limit their performance and they limit their ability. Some children with autism or other disabilities, genetic chromosomal disabilities, they may have deficits in fine motor skills. So their hands might not be as strong as a typically developing child. Autism, a lot of times when we think about autism, we think about the delays in language, or we think about the stereotypic stimming type behaviors we might see them do. But one of the things that we don't think about often in children with autism are the social deficits. So autism is a deficit in social functioning. It's a deficit in their ability to have conversations, to share a story, to control or understand their tone of voice. And so there are a lot of social deficits in children with autism. And so that might be a skill deficit that we need to address. And then also learning disabilities. Those aren't visible. We can't tell when someone has a learning disability just by looking at them, but it is an actual disability in the way that their brain processes or functions, or learns and encodes new material. And so when we're looking at deficits in impulse control, everyone can sit in a seat, right? I can sit down in this chair, but how long can I sit in that chair? Some people can sit for very long periods of time. Some people, we have a really hard time sitting still, maybe are more fidgety, more moving around, wiggling in the chair. That's not necessarily that they can't sit still, but it may be very hard for them. And some children may not be able to actually sit still. So we don't really think about sitting still as being a skill deficit, but some children may not physically be capable of sitting in a chair, waiting to be called on. So holding their hand up and waiting to be called on, that may be an actual skill deficit. Being able to control the blurting out. So just because you can control it, or the other kids in the class can control it, does not mean that the child that you're working with can control their blurting out. It may be a skill deficit. Turn taking. Being able to wait your turn. So control that impulse to wait your turn. If you want a funny video, go through and watch the marshmallow test. I'll post it to my Facebook page. But go through and watch or Google marshmallow test, and you can watch some kids that really have a hard time waiting for their turn. And deficits in fine motor skills, sometimes that presents as a deficit in being able to write. Because if we don't write very much anymore in a technological age, most everything that we do is typed. Every now and then I'll have to hand write something. And oh my goodness, when I'm hand writing something, I notice that the muscles in my hand really start to fatigue very quickly. And that's painful. And so children that have fine motor deficits, the muscles in their hands are more likely to fatigue or to hurt. So if you've ever done something with your hands that you've done a repetitive motion with for a long period of time that you aren't used to practicing, it can actually cause pain in your hands and muscle fatigue. And so sometimes children will refuse or avoid written assignments, coloring, scissors, handwriting, things like that, because it actually is a skill deficit in their fine motor skills. This also applies to daily living skills, like refusing to get dressed or refusing to brush their teeth. It's not always a skill deficit, but we always want to make sure that we've ruled out fine motor skill delays that could be impacting or influencing the behavior. Children with autism, I love working with children with autism. It's my passion, but they physically cannot engage in gestures sometimes. And so if I ask a child, so show me what it looks like to brush your teeth, they may not be able to say, oh, you go like this and this. And so if I tell them, hey, tell me what happened, I'm going to use my hands. I'm going to be able to tell you what happened. But children with autism have a hard time telling stories, recalling events, using gestures to supplement their communication as far as, well, I was standing here and he was standing here and this is what happened. Being able to recognize their tone of voice. So sometimes they don't understand when they're talking too quietly or talking too loudly. And so you may be getting on to them for yelling, but they may not have the awareness to understand that their tone of voice is yelling in someone else's perspective. Understanding proximity and not standing too close to somebody may be a skill deficit. And when we look at academics, those are commonly caught skill deficits, but deficits in the speed in which they read or reading comprehension, math computation, early numeracy skills, those are often skill deficits. And so we always just want to make sure, can the child engage in this skill that we are expecting them to do as a replacement behavior?